Well, let's see, this is the facets of his work, which is a formalist of the first rank. And I was impressed very much with his sonnets. He was extremely accomplished as a sonnet writer, a sonneteer in poetic jargon. And I've selected 3 sonnets, one that I think capture the horror genre that he excelled in so effectively, and one about the relationship between the creator and the created, the artist and his art, and then a hilarious one about, of all things, an evangelist. One thing that we failed to touch on this morning, I included, was his incredible sense of humor, for which he does not often receive a lot of credit. You read about how he was into nihilism and doom and gloom, but he had me laughing until I was in stitches as I was reading his doggerel and his wonderful limericks, and it brought to mind Kipling, except I'm not so sure he didn't do a better job than Kipling himself with some of his limericks. But before I read the 3 sonnets I've highlighted, I'd like to go to a little poem about a bell. That, in his own admission, Edgar Allan Poe was one of his favorite poets who preceded him. And of course, one of Poe's best-known poems is The Bells. We all know The Raven, but The Bells is haunting. Imagine using bells 7 times in a row and making it work. The bells, 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 the moaning and the groaning of the bells. That poem still haunts me, but here's his poem about bells, and his is a little bell of brass that I think possibly is a tip of the hat to one of his favorite poets, Edgar Allan Poe. This poem is very interesting in terms of form. I think it's the shortest lines. I mean, hark is its own line. And you know, it has longer lines and short lines, and it's all rhymed verse. And I think he employs a very intricate rhyme scheme that I hope you pick up on as I read it. And one of the poetic devices he excels at in this poem is onomatopoeia, which is a bizarre word. You probably remember it from that dreaded literature class. And it's basically how the sound of a word mimics the subject that it's writing about, that the word is written in reference to, like whoosh, the word whoosh, whooshes. And there's a lot of that wonderful onomatopoeia in this. See if you pick up on it as I did. Little bell of brass. Tingle, jingle, dingle, tingle, hear my brazen tones, brazen as a witch's curse, piping to the universe, on a desert, on a mountain of bare stones. Like a lark, O discord veils, hear my bells' metal tones, hark to the tales that it tells as it drones. Tingle on, tingle, dingle, jingle. Ah, my little bell of brass, there'll be no echoed note of your tones. Not a single echo float when up through my dusty bones grows the grass. It's the clack of a beetle, it's the braying of an ass, and no doubt I'll ride through hell on the clatter of my bell, on the jangle and the wrangle of my little bell of brass. But I thought that was sort of tongue-in-cheek and a wonderful poem that captures what it's written about. Can you just picture a little brass bell, you know? Tongue-in-cheek because he's sort of letting Poe have it too, you know, for his great iron bells and wedding bells and silver bells and all that. Says, I'll show him a thing or two about bells. And next is 3 sonnets. The first, we all know about his horror, which I think certainly rivals Stephen King, who's rather well known these days. And I read where King himself said that one of his favorite stories, horror stories, is none other than Pigeons from Hell by yours truly, Robert E. Howard. So that's quite a statement coming from someone like Stephen King. This is the tavern. There stands close by a dim, wolf-haunted wood, a tavern like a monster, brooding thing. About its sullen gables no birds sing. Oft a lone traveler when the moon is blood, lights from his horse in quest of sleep and meal. His footfalls fade within and sound no more. He comes not forth, but from a secret door bearing a grisly burden. Shadows steal. By day, 'neath trees whose silent green leaves glisten, the tavern crouches, hating day and light. A lurking vampire, terrible and lean. Sometimes behind its windows may be seen vague, leprous faces, haggard, fungus white, that peer and start and ever seem to listen. How would you like to go by that tavern tonight? You better have a drink. But I think I'm impressed with the concision of his language. I could find no waste, not an extraneous article or adjective. And fungus white, leprous, look at vague, leprous faces. Talk about descriptive. But I think that's a near perfect sonnet. And this next one, Flaming Marble, I think has some interesting things to say about the relationship between the artist and the art created. I don't know if you've ever heard this, hopefully you have, but a lot of creative artists feel like they're vessels. And they're just vessels to receive a much higher power and channel it and let it go, and then it's through with them. You know, we're picked just as vehicles for the expression of this powerful entity, whatever it is. I remember when I finally got around to publishing my first book, The Lighthouse Keeper, back in 2001, and when I held it in my hands, I realized I was of no consequence anymore, that it had a life of its own, and quite honestly, I felt like a prostitute. Because I thought about all the hours and all the work that went into the little book that no longer needed me. And I think he's touching on that, if I interpret this poem the way I think he may have intended it on one of many levels. Flaming Marble. I carved a woman out of marble when the walls of Athens echoed to my fame. And in the myrtle crown was shrined my name. I wrought with skill beyond all earthly ken, and into cold inhuman beauty then I breathed a mist of white and living flame. And from her pedestal she rose and came to snare the souls and rend the hearts of men. Without a soul, without a human heart, she broke the crystal gong of mortal pride. And even I fell victim to my art. With bitter, joyous love I claimed my bride, and still with frozen hate that never dies, she sits and stares at me with icy eyes. Like, what are you doing looking at me, boy? But I feel like he felt distanced from his own creation. Do you pick up on any of that? And like, wow, I breathed life into this thing that's taken on a life of its own and no longer has any use for R-E-H. And finally, we get around to his wonderful sense of humor in Evangelist. I thought this one was particularly interesting because this is often known as the Bible Belt, and a real sort of conservative and traditional area of the state where there's almost a church on every block. And I'm not meaning to be disrespectful or anything, just descriptive. But you know, traditional religion reigns supreme in many parts of Texas, certainly in West Texas. And I can't help but think that he was saying, well, you know, about these evangelists, some are hypocritical. And they're not really what they claim to be. And so see what you think here. How to select a successful evangelist. First, find a man who has a goodly voice, whose yell shall shake the very topmost spire when he proclaims some rival rev a liar. Pass up the knowledge if he has the noise. Next, see he mixes freely with the boys. A man with carefully concealed desire, but one whose sex appeal is like a fire. Then he is sure of all the women's choice. Yet let him be discreet. Let not a rumor attend his trail. Let him condemn all thought, boast loudly of the evil he has fought. Enough vulgarity to pass as humor. He shall be sure then gather in the 10 and lead 10,000 from the ways of sin. So I thought that was, in its own way, very, very funny. And, in many cases, sad to say, very insightful. But those are some poems that that I thought were beautifully crafted, 3 of which are sonnets. And our friend and your colleague, Frank Kaufman, who's couldn't be with us today, wrote this marvelous paper, The Top 10 Poems by Robert E. Howard. And he lists them in descending order. He starts out with 10 and works his way to number 1. And he gives a little justification for his selection. And I thought it was rather brilliant. And based on what I read, I don't know that I would argue with certainly most of his selections. But I'm not going to be real specific, no more specific than that. But he does have Samaria ranked number 1. And since I'm reading Samaria, and I'm going to talk about Samaria a little bit tonight, I'll not go into that right now. But